Okay, just is for both of you, just a little bit of a background about both, please. I think Rory's audio is muted. Now it's on mute.
There we go. So I was just saying, I just got the recording notification, which prevented me clicking the unmute button. What kind of background would you like?
Anything, because I read a little bit about the very humorous vice chairman title. Apart from that, anything else that you would like to kind of add on?
Yeah, I suppose it partly arose from a slight frustration with the advertising industry, that the advertising industry deploys quite astute psychology, but confines itself very largely to the communications realm. And the same creative talents, but also the same behavioral science insights can equally be applied to the design of services and experiences, as is generally dedicated to the design of communications, and yet it generally doesn't receive the same attention. So that once you move out of the communications realm, those questions which within communication might be partly answered by creative people or by by research or interesting human insight, suddenly get handed over to engineers who have a completely different set of status markers and a completely different set of priorities. And that is, by the way, it's very important to clarify, I'm not disparaging the role of engineering in transportation. That would be absurd. But simply to say that sometimes there's a psychological solution to a problem where a engineering or physical problem would be either intractable, expensive, or inefficient. And I suppose the whole thing partly arose from my innate interest with transportation as a sector, a slightly nerdish obsession with trains, but also from that joke I told at the TED conference in, I think it was something like 2009, which is that, yes, you can make the train faster, but you can also make the journey more enjoyable.
Absolutely.
And if you look at the transport sector as a whole, of course, cruise ships would be an extreme case at one end of the spectrum. No one boasts about how fast the cruise ship is, right, because the whole point is that time on board is supposed to be rewarding. Okay. And, so my argument is that every single, anything involving human behavior or perception is of necessity something of a wicked complex problem. And it's completely unrealistic to reduce it to simple objective physical metrics of time, speed, capacity. Even punctuality, by the way, is partly a psychological question, not just a question of objective measurement.
Absolutely. What about you, Pete? What is your take on this?
Yeah, I think I've come on a similar sort of journey to Rory there. In terms of my background, I joined Rory's Ogilvy behavioral science team when it emerged around the early 2010s. And we've spent the best part of now coming on 10 years trying to apply principles of psychology to sectors that might otherwise have not utilized it to its full potential. And that was covering areas of compliance, safety in factories, sustainable behavior change, recycling, but even going further into retail environments, how people understand new behaviors. And I think Rory and I come from looking at transport and saying, hey, there's an opportunity here. We use the phrase, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, to describe what is a psychological bias. That there's a propensity with someone who has a mental model of the world to use that tool that is at their disposal. And we think transport could probably do well to balance out and actually look to some of the psychological and behavioral science disciplines that can solve some of its problems and challenges more cheaply, more efficiently, more sustainably, more inclusively. And we use the book to illustrate lots of examples of best practice and brilliant international examples and ones from the past. And then we also are at pains to identify some of the issues and contribute some of our own ideas to the table.
Lovely. Both of you are seasoned stalwarts in behavioral science over the years. Coming from where we are, we in the UAE we have what is called the Ministry of Happiness. All right. Do you think there is a potential? This is just very tangential, but do you think there is a potential to look at having something like a Ministry of Behavioral Science across governments, across countries?
Ministry of Happiness isn't a bad place to start. Because I think I'd say that though I am a fairly enthusiastic supporter of free market capitalism as a problem-solving mechanism, by and large, it's also fair to say that it doesn't answer fundamental questions like, after we've created all this wealth, what's it actually for? I think it, there's a danger that economics has essentially created a kind of circular logic where the purpose of life is the accumulation of wealth in and of itself. Whereas, of course, you don't have to be a mega philosopher to argue that wealth is ultimately a means to some other end. And so questions around happiness and well-being seem to be quite fundamental to behavioral science. It's worth noting that, of course, Daniel Kahneman, who in many ways is the kind of founding father of behavioral economics, half of his research with and without Amos Tversky has been in that field of happiness and well-being. And indeed research about the extent to which wealth and happiness correlate, which they do, but not in a linear fashion by any
Absolutely.
So actually, to have a behavioral science arm, which is a department of the Ministry of Happiness, wouldn't be a totally crazy approach. Right. Because I see the questions as interrelated, which Absolutely. Is that you can, it is possible to solve a problem. Ultimately, it's worth noting that human perception, which is the product of evolution, requires a mixture of qualities to generate happiness. One very important point, by the way, is around fairness. So that you can generate a huge amount of wealth, but the amount of happiness generated by that wealth will, I think, be seriously impinged if people feel that the rewards are not actually equitably distributed. So, in terms of well-being, we've evolved in such a way that life is not simply a wealth maximization engine. And it's also worth noting, very relevant in the UAE, I would argue, that to some extent, the happiness we derive from wealth is actually comparative, not absolute as well.
Right.
So,
if one were to ask...
I carry on. Sorry. Yeah.
No, sorry. Please complete.
But Pete, go on. Yeah.
I could add to that by, certainly endorsing that the Ministry of Happiness is a smart idea. I think the book series editor we've worked with to publish this, Professor Diane Coyle, might well be more optimistic towards integrating that happiness perspective within the disciplines of economics and perhaps within engineering to ensure that that it's not siloed, let's say. And one of the important reasons for that might be a really fundamental thing we look at in the book, which is how do we define someone's utility for transport? So a lot of that has been so far imposed upon people, that not people's happiness, but the thing that they're trying to maximize is a quick, cheap, short, convenient journey. Our contention is, when you look at people's behavior on transport, yes, it sometimes conforms to that, but many times people seem to be exhibiting all sorts of things that we wouldn't quite call biases, like a comfort bias and a scenic route bias and a very reliable trip bias and a being able to sit side by side with someone to talk to each other bias. Sometimes people have priorities to maximize some other thing. And it's been a really interesting journey to look at how you might need to define someone's utility and benefit more broadly, and sometimes it's constructed by their own understanding and perception of what makes a good trip. And it's been great to be challenged along the way to help define that, rather than simply have a sporadic area of nudges and policies that don't connect.
Right. This leads me to segue into our next question. Do you see this book as a series that can bring in other aspects of infrastructure and mobility under its wing? and offer a gentle nudge or a almighty shove? What is your take?
Sorry, there's an interesting aspect, by the way, I'm going to add to transport, which I think makes it important. And I was going to suggest that the behavioral science organization can be linked to both the Ministry of Happiness and the Ministry of Sustainability.
Yeah.
Because it's worth noting that economics tends to assume that the route to happiness is ever greater levels of consumption. And as a result, I think economics has created a kind of doctrine which will eventually come on a collision course with what is ultimately sustainable and also what is ultimately happiness generating. Am I right in saying the UAE has actually gone to the Friday, Saturday weekend?
We've gone to the Saturday, Sunday weekend. We were just discussing.
You got to the Saturday, Sunday weekend.
Yes,
yeah, interesting.
Yes, yeah. From the 1st of Jan, yeah.
I also noticed talking, to other Middle Eastern countries. I think one of them was trying a car-free days once a month.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
We do need to ask the question: at what point do you become sufficiently wealthy that, for example, a 3-day weekend might be the answer?
In fact, within the UAE, Rory, good point, Rory. In Sharjah, which is one of the 7 Emirates of UAE, Sharjah has a 3-day weekend. It's Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Okay, whereas in Dubai and the other rest of the 6 Emirates, it's Friday half day because we have the prayers here in the afternoon. So 12:30 you disperse, and then Saturday, Sunday, you kind of come back on Monday. Whereas Sharjah within the UAE itself is already in a 3-day weekend.
Understood. Yeah. Now, that's a question. I would also argue that in some respects, I've argued this to the United States, you might actually, Henry Ford spotted this. He realized that unless you had a 2-day weekend, it wouldn't be worth anybody buying a car. And Henry Ford spotted that actually a reasonable degree of leisure is actually a necessary precondition for the growth of a healthy consumer economy. I would argue that Americans spend too much on goods and not enough on experiences because they're so extraordinarily constrained in vacation time.
Right.
And it's strange that the only other person who suggested this, the 2 people who've actually suggested this, are Henry Ford and Bernie Sanders, okay, the arch capitalist and the kind of extreme socialist.
Right.
So, what I also think is interesting about both environmentalism and transport is they're both network questions. Okay, there isn't a single right answer, which is at the moment everybody does this and we need everybody to do that. If you operate a transport network, the worst thing you can have is actually a uniformity of behavior and a uniformity of choice making. Because if everybody chooses the same road to get from A to B, that road will be congested and the second best road will be empty. Okay?
Yeah.
Right. So actually, we also have an interesting problem here. I think people definitely agree with me on this, won't you, Pete? Which is that in use of the London Underground, what you want is actually not everybody choosing rationally by criteria which are defined by the network operator as rational or by the designer of the algorithm or the transport app. You actually benefit from diversity of decision making. So that if you have a bunch of people who need to get from, let's take an example, Liverpool Street to Notting Hill Gate, which you can take as a slower journey on the Circle Line, but which is air conditioned and not very deep below ground, or a faster journey on the Central Line, which is deeper below ground and in the summer is not maybe by UAE standards, but by London standards, intolerably hot. Okay.
Right.
The perfect solution is certainly not to have everybody choosing one or the other. It's to have people deploying what you might call, non-stable preferences to make most efficient use of the network as a whole. If you can get 10% of people off a motorway to take the scenic route or the low variance route or the cross-country route, the whole system benefits.
Yeah.
I think that's, by the way, also true of environmentalism, where you don't want everybody to do everything simultaneously. You want everybody to do something and some people to do more than others. So, I mean, okay, I'll take an extreme case here. One thing we don't want is everybody to switch to electric cars overnight. It'll be a total catastrophe for charging infrastructure, perhaps for the electrical grid. I would also argue, Pete may disagree with me, I think for 10, 15, 20 years' time, there will be a subset of the population who would be better off, and where the environment would be better off, if they stayed with a gasoline car. Because there's an environmental cost to the manufacture of a new car. If those people have a reliable gasoline car with which they're happy, and they do a proportionately low mileage, leave them alone. So this is an interesting case where persuasion might actually be better, precisely because it's noisier and messier, than legislation. Okay, if someone has a 25-year-old Land Rover Defender, where the Land Rover Defender is an interesting vehicle because such a large proportion of those ever built are still on the road, right. And they operate a farm and they do a relatively low mileage. You don't want to ban those people from having that car, actually.
In fact, just to dovetail to that, there is a 6-month waiting period in the UAE for the latest Defender.
Interesting. It's glorious, actually, rather glorious car. And so, ultimately there'll be an electric Defender. That's great. We're really happy about that. But actually, this is an interesting case where, funnily enough, similar to epidemiology, by the way, where, it's an interesting case in that in order to stop the spread of a virus, legislation is to some extent a blunt instrument. And sometimes, by the way, the answers are slightly counterintuitive. There was a very interesting case in epidemiology where they said, actually, although it seems completely bonkers, you should vaccinate young people before you vaccinate old people. Now, I don't think that was ethically acceptable because old people are at much more risk than young people. Right. But the argument was, since it's young people who actually create super spreading events,
right,
the health of the whole would actually be better if you effectively vaccinated people who went to raves and people who broke rules and went to parties were actually, in technical terms, a greater priority for vaccination than old people who are already shielding at home. Now, okay, you run up against an ethical conundrum there. But quite often, I think here, we have a case where, in environmental terms, what we need is a managed transition from one form of energy to another. And you don't want everybody to rush at once. And also, there are some people for whom the cost of the transition is very low. You want those people to make the transition early. There are other people for whom it's very, very high, and you want to allow those people to move later or not at all. And so I think there's something very, very important here, which is that in a transport network, actually blunt instrument interventions actually are counterproductive.
Pete, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I can add to Rory's perspective. It's a wonderful take, isn't it, of the broader sort of network and social or even ecological view of how we all interact and cooperate. To add to it is even a people-centered view of saying there should be a diversity of choices and abilities within a given person. And wouldn't it be brilliant? And we conclude the book by talking about balance of expanding people's transport repertoires. So there's great benefit for the individual to have more choices available for them to walk or cycle or drive or take public transport for the same trip, but in different contexts, given that we know people don't have stable preferences and their social situation changes. So we try and paint a picture of showing how there would actually be more resilience too and more network benefit by having people to have a second option they're familiar with, a third option, a fourth option, so that if disruption occurs, they can do things differently. Now, where this comes for sort of implications for transport operators or for people in other sectors too, it's worth thinking about not necessarily switching someone permanently from they are a driver to they are a active transport person, but merely saying, what would we need to do for someone to try this once? And maybe what would we need to do for them to do it the 5th time? And let's maybe leave it there. And we've got if we took that approach, how many more millions of people could we get that had the skills and the fluency and to see the benefits for themselves rather than for the benefits to be sort of imposed top down by the designer?
I mean, one very simple thing, which is uh, when you look at transport preference through the lens of the individual traveller, not through this homo transporticus aggregate model of preference, okay? Now, I think they do this in Denmark already. I think because I gave a long spiel suggesting it to Danish railways as an idea, only to be told we already do this. You give people free rail travel on their birthday, okay? Now, that at one level just seems like a cute thing to do. It's actually quite important because if once or twice a year, people who are car obsessives make one rail journey or two, if you can get people from 0 to 1, or maybe 0 to 3. So every year you make 3 rail journeys. So you're familiar with where you park, where you buy a ticket, where the routes go, what the timetable is. The first few rail journeys you take are much more difficult than the 5th, the 7th, the 9th. And so just incentivizing everybody to make a small number of rail journeys, my own proposal was that when you buy a car tax disc, it should maybe cost you £50 more annually, but it should come with £80 of rail vouchers, of non-transferable rail vouchers. Someone who makes 4 or 5 rail journeys a year is likely to make a more nuanced decision in the future than someone who's never traveled by train.
Right.
And so, incentivizing actually people to try new things occasionally increases both individual resilience and the resilience of the overall system.
Yeah, I think you make a very valid point here because especially post the pandemic, I think MRTS design needs to be appended is the clarion call. And probably an opportunity to reconnect with communities that are disenfranchised over the period of time. So you mentioned about whether it is lower fares or freer transport, greater frequency as the case might be. So you bring in people who are probably well under the radar, or you bring in people who would never looked at trains as a mode of transport at all.
I mean, this was an interesting case with my own father, which is when my mother died a few years ago. Obviously, as a couple, they'd been highly inclined to drive everywhere. And by the way, actually, driving everywhere as a couple is much nicer than driving on your own because you've got conversation. It's less lonely. But also the economic case for taking the train completely changes when it's just you versus 2 people.
Right.
And I noticed this, that my father started using the train to travel for the first time in decades, really, for significant journeys, combined with the fact that he was getting older and found long drives, just cognitively a bit more demanding.
Right.
And so it was interesting that the first few journeys he made were disproportionately challenging. Where do I park? How do I get to the station? Where do I buy a ticket? Even where do the trains go? Okay. And by the 5th journey, suddenly it had become more or less second nature. And so there's a huge value, this isn't really in the field of compulsion or economic incentives. It's simply in injecting a degree of variety at the individual level into transport preferences. And I find it's a very interesting question. They're also, by the way, I mean, hugely, when you look at it, a large part of innovation. If you want to people to adopt a behavior which is completely new, okay, that poses even further challenges in that not only do they not do it, they don't know anybody else who does it either. And so with the introduction of the electric car, you get this extraordinary issue of range anxiety, which in truth actually isn't much of a problem, but it takes you 4 months or maybe 2 months of electric car ownership before the problem goes away. That's very interesting because if you look at it, the biggest obstacle to electric car adoption may be to a large part irrational fear. Funnily enough, I've got an electric car. I don't even have the facility to charge it at home yet because I'm waiting for a few months before we install a communal solution for where we live. And much to my surprise, I discovered that really isn't a problem. That even an electric car with no home charging facility, and now if you live deep in the countryside, it would be. But actually, if you live in a reasonably high density populated area, not a problem at all. It will be even less of a problem in 3 months' time. But this fear, which I myself experienced when I first had the electric car, desperately looking at the range while I was driving in a way I certainly didn't when I had a petrol car. This fear is possibly, for many people, the biggest obstacle to the adoption of the technology. And so, the extent to which, the greatest example of all would be Zoom, which is what we're doing now. It took a pandemic to get business and to some extent consumers to adopt this at a scale which actually allows the technology to deliver its benefits.
Right.
Because, of course, network technologies are particularly unusual in that owning the world's only fax machine is worthless, right? Because there's no one else to fax to. Being a Zoom enthusiast, as both Pete and I were pre-pandemic, is only of limited value if you can't get anybody else to join you on a Zoom call.
Right.
So that's a perfect case where, if you like, the forced adoption for a limited period of a new technology will continue to have lasting environmental benefits going forward. And, by the way, I mean, if you think about it, there's a wonderful phrase in the motoring industry, which is the perfect part is no part. If you can design a car so it doesn't require the part at all, that's the best part you can possibly have, because no part can't go wrong. And I would argue there should be a phrase in the transport industry, which has been missing, which is the perfect journey is no journey at all.
What normally you would call in psychology as frictionless.
Yeah, but I mean, a Zoom call imposes less it's not environmentally neutral, by the way. We ought to be clear about this.
Right.
But it imposes, I think, less cost on congestion, less cost on the environment than any other mode of human interaction. And therefore, the extent to which you can get people to migrate to Zoom where it's appropriate, where it makes sense, is hugely beneficial to road users. It's beneficial to cyclists. It's beneficial to train. It's not beneficial to train operators, arguably, but it's hugely beneficial to train users.
Yeah.
Because the problem of overcrowded trains has been, to some extent. I mean, I joked about the UK, where I said that actually widespread use of video conferencing gives the UK a world-class rail and road network at zero cost. Because it solves the problem not by more roads or more railways, but by fewer passengers, and by those passengers, this is the most important bit, by those passengers being more evenly spread across time.
Yeah.
So even if you get people to do a Zoom call at 9 o'clock in the morning and then traveled into work at 10:30, that's a major improvement to transport infrastructure, every bit as significant as building another railway or running another train.
Unless they decide to impose a congestion tax on Zooms at certain times.
Yes. Funnily enough, did you know that actually surprised me, which is I thought at the beginning of the pandemic that video conferencing technology would fall over, or that the broadband backbone in the UK would suffer. And interestingly, probably the reason it doesn't is because of Netflix, actually. That the volume of entertainment use of the internet actually essentially created a degree of robustness. Yeah. That actually, while you're on a Zoom call, it's actually less demanding of the broadband network than if you're watching a 4K film.
Right.
But that surprised me. I thought, okay, we're going to have real problems here, and nothing, literally.
And in due course, I'm sure it'll be written about what would happen if the coronavirus had mutated at a different time, 20 years earlier, 10 years earlier, or even 10 years later than now.
Yeah.
It's something you can play with, that sort of counterfactual histories. But it would have been startling to see how the internet had developed if it had happened in the year 2000 instead of the year 2020.
I think, by the way, I think there are asymmetries. It's always worth noting. This is particularly true in B2B behavior. There's a wonderful quote from Warren Buffett, or it might be Charlie Munger, where he said that lemmings as a species are idiots, but because they all do the same stupid thing together, there's no case of an individual lemming receiving a bad press. So in the same way, it's often better for your reputation in business to do the stupid thing that everybody else does rather than the intelligent thing that nobody else does.
Wisdom of the crowds.
It's exactly, and it's safety in numbers, if you like. And so if you want to avoid blame, there's a very strong weighting in business activity towards the conventional, which is if you fly to let's say you say, we've got a meeting with our client in Frankfurt, we're going to fly over for the day. Okay. Now, if you then fly over for the day, there's an air traffic control strike in France. The flight's delayed by an hour and a half. The meeting's badly delayed. You only get to see the guy for 20 minutes. You don't get much blame because all the blame goes to British Airways or French air traffic control. If you said, no, let's do a Zoom call in 2018, and the Zoom call went a bit wonky, okay, now it's your fault because you didn't fly. And so the extent to which collective behavior gets trapped in a kind of default mode, where the reputational risk of doing the new thing is inordinately higher than the reputational risk of doing what everybody else does, I think does mean that things like business travel had become kind of, they'd kind of become trapped in amber, really, as behaviors. They were behaviors which were almost performative, and they were ritualistic. And the other thing, of course, which is that if the interesting thing with the Zoom call is that the downside versus a physical meeting is salient and visible, whereas the opportunity cost of demanding that you meet every time you talk to someone is less quantifiable.
Right.
So I think it is undoubtedly worth looking also at biases in collective decision making, particularly when it refers to business travel, but also in consumer travel. There's a strong bias to do what I've done before. The two big human defaults are do what I've done before and do what everybody else does. And so getting people to innovate or experiment is time. And by the way, there's a really important thing here. Now, I'm often a critic of high-speed rail. But the one thing you won't find me do, if they do open a high-speed railway, is criticizing it because it's used very little in its first 2 or 3 years. Because one of the things I know about High Speed 1, which is the high-speed rail network that serves East Kent, it runs on the same lines as the Eurostar, okay? In its initial years, was unbelievably underused. It's now a spectacular success. And actually, the understanding that, contrary to what economists think, which is you open a railway, everybody does the maths and now decides to use the railway rather than the car, it genuinely doesn't work like that. That actually behavior diffuses by osmosis through a population. And you can only really determine whether that railway line is a success 5 or 6 years into its existence.
True.
And that's the sigmoid curve of kind of innovation. And I think, I think it's very important we understand complexity theory alongside behavioral science before we start making hard and fast judgments about what transport ideas are a success or a failure.
Pete, you may want to come in here. There is a quote that I'm reading from now. Stephanie Wiggins, she's the CEO of Los Angeles Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And she made a quote saying that the pandemic made the invisible visible.
Interesting.
Okay, yeah. What do you have to say to that?
In what sense is the invisible visible? I'm not sure I follow.
So what she's obviously attributing is the fact that there is a lot of potential consumers or commuters that they have been ignoring over a period of time. And that has come right front and center because of the pandemic, So it was probably taken for granted or under the radar, but now it is coming right front and center. So they've now kind of decided to kind of change their strategy.
Yeah, that is precisely something Rory and I have written about, and we think transport probably tends to over-index in researching its current travellers and under-index researching the non-traveller. So typically research methods will be to stand at a station or go through a bus or speak to people who are traveling and ask them what their needs are. So you're sampling I think you'd call it sampling the dependent variable. You're right, what the pandemic reveals is the importance of also sampling all the people who weren't traveling at that time and finding out what their needs were and considering how you might adapt the proposition to account for them. And I think what we probably saw was where say public transport was either advised against, or people were compelled to make it only for essential journeys. People needing to change those travel habits, and those things suddenly do become visible. Where we come in is probably looking at making where we might interpret the invisible to be visible is not merely the behavior, but scratching under the surface to understand and make visible the different human metrics that constitute a good trip. And the research need to understand it's really, really difficult, because you're trying to get people to say something they can barely articulate, which was, what was it that made that trip fly by? Or what was it that made that trip particularly comfortable or enjoyable? Or why were you particularly anxious about the punctuality of that thing this time? And that's where psychology really needs to sort of pull its sleeves up and see how it can take lab-based approaches and apply them in the real world.
Do you see all this stemming from an overemphasis on making STEM the flavor of the season? Science, technology, engineering, math, and it is coming at the cost of culture, anthropology, history, etc., because too much of it is number-oriented, statistics-oriented. And there is a quote, which, if I recollect right, consumers are statistics, customers are people. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to sit and say that it's in competition with. Large parts of our argument try to be yes and. So it's, while you're doing this, also do this. Like these approaches needn't necessarily be competitive. They don't necessarily crowd each other out. Certainly psychology sits at that nexus between science and art, really looking at the qualitative human experience, which, as I've said, is so hard to put numbers and pin down what pain and happiness means to somebody, versus these quantitative areas that have a more eternal answer. Rory, I think you've spoken a little bit about the
yes. There's a wonderful book on this, which is a strange book because it's written by an anarchist anthropologist. And I agree with you that anthropology, Gillian Tett, who writes for the FT, has written a book called Anthrovision. And she's interesting because she's an anthropologist who almost by accident ended up in business and commerce and government, working for the Financial Times, and still continues to bring an anthropologist's eye to the behaviors. She spotted before the financial crisis that there were a whole bunch of people effectively in the field of CDOs and highly synthetic financial products who are completely unaware of the world outside their particular tribe, and they'd acquired kind of tribal blind spots, if you like. And very, very, very interesting approach. And I would argue, for example, that I'll give you a perfect example of this. Okay, there was a better route, I think, Ovara proposed for High Speed 2 in the UK, which was a little bit longer because it actually ran the track alongside the M40 motorway. Now, the great thing of running the track along the M40 motorway is that if you already live next to a motorway, you're not that discombobulated by having a train added to the traffic. Okay, if you live in the depths of the countryside and suddenly you have a very noisy railway line, it's a completely different impingement on your general peace and quiet. And the reason it was rejected is because that route would have taken 5 minutes longer and maybe 6 minutes longer. And according to their model, every minute of time saving was worth X billion dollars, according to an economic model where time spent on the train is deemed economically useless. Now, as anybody knows, the invention of the laptop, the invention of the BlackBerry, actually, before the laptop, has meant that idea that when you're on a train, you're economically inert. It's never been true. but it certainly isn't true post about 2005.
Right.
Okay, it's a nonsense. But also, I would also argue that the idea that anybody's decision to travel to Manchester will be significantly affected by whether it takes 55 minutes or whether it takes 61 is just a nonsense. Don't get me wrong, okay, a 30-minute, 20-minute increase in journey time might have some observable effect on people's propensity to take that route. But the idea that people are such time and efficiency maximizers that they care about the 5 minutes, I think that should have been rejected at the outset. And yet what you create, of course, is you create these models, and it then becomes impossible for people to escape the models, even when they defy common sense, because everything that is done to date has been agreed on the basis of that model.
Absolutely.
And what James C. Scott, who wrote Seeing Like a State, calls it, he calls it high modernism, which is you can see it in everything. Le Corbusier, okay, cities designed to look good from the air, which don't really function at ground level. Brasilia, you know, these cities which make sense to the designer, but where actually the designer's aerial view of how a city functions is completely at odds with how people really live in cities. And so, I mean, if you notice the Le Corbusier approach, you know, you have a business district, you have a residential district, you have a retail district. Okay, well, you know, if you actually look at a typical mother's journey from the period, what it was that you took your child out in a pram to get it some fresh air and to get yourself a bit of exercise, during which time you popped into a shop, you popped into a cafe. And so the entire premise was designed really to win arguments at the level of the aggregate, where those very arguments and what makes sense to the person seeing buildings from the air. I mean, you could actually make the case that fascism and aviation have a kind of relationship. You know, Mussolini, if you look at it, those right-wing top-down regimes were really, really keen on planes. Okay. Yeah. Now, actually, you know, you look at cities that have evolved, you know, you look at an aerial picture of Bruges or of London, okay, they make absolutely no sense from the air in many ways because they've evolved over time. And the typical, so this is, by the way, really important to a place like Dubai. I think Canary Wharf made a huge mistake in its conception, in that it got the mainstream retail fairly successfully right. It has large offices, but it didn't create space for smaller businesses of a kind no one had predicted the need for to evolve over time and to create an ecosystem of smaller retail operators, boutique restaurants, you know, niche entities like that. And so, you may want to create a ground plan, but you should leave room in the ground plan for evolutionary factors. You know, the things we never anticipated.
People are not going to give up South Bank for Canary Wharf in a hurry.
No, I mean, that was the problem in a sense. And you know, over time, it will self-correct to a degree. But I think you'd agree with that, Pete, having worked there, that there was a missing ecosystem of kind of, you know, non-chain entities, certainly for the first 10 to 15 years.
I would. I live right next to Canary Wharf, and I've seen its rapid evolution even in the past year or two. As you can see, its previous selection pressures were broadly straight retail and price of office space per square meter, but now its selection pressures have changed so dramatically to residential needs and creating a sort of place-based and meaning that you now see all sorts of tourist activities, of art installations, of small businesses, of lots more homes, and yeah, it's quite startling to see.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you both, how much of a factor does choice architecture play in the design of transportation systems? And then this question is inspired by this famous example of the US Airways and Captain Sully, who landed the flight on the Hudson and saved about 180, 190 passengers. apparently the cockpit panel, the instrument panel in the cockpit was so simply designed that he knew that he had 3 minutes of flying time. And if he flew at a certain altitude, at this level of speed, he would be able to land it on the icy Hudson, but very close to where the ferry services were.
That's right.
Okay, so decision making was very, very easy. Do you think all the transportation systems and anything to do with public infrastructure, etc., etc., it does take into account choice architecture?
Well, one thing Pete and I are both alarmed by in choice architecture is the fact that every single that's not quite true. There are some very notable and exciting exceptions, but that everything from sat navs to public transport apps tend to optimize around the same dimension, and it tends to be speed. And it's a really interesting question, because one of the first things I would say from an individual point of view is there is no single right answer to how should you make a particular journey in a way that's context free. Okay, so in the summer you may want to go on an air conditioned tube line. In the winter you may not care. The question I always ask is, how should you get to the airport? And it's actually a very complicated question, because it depends how long are you going for, which affects the cost of parking if you plan to drive. Okay.
Yeah.
How much luggage do you have, which affects, are you traveling with children or not with children? Also, you may want to choose a low variance route, not the route that's fastest on average, because you can't afford to miss your plane by getting stuck in traffic in motorway gridlock. Is it raining? Literally, there will be because if it's raining, the likelihood of some sort of gridlock on a motorway is much higher. All these kind of things need to be factored in.
Absolutely.
And yet, by what Nassim Taleb calls naive optimization, where you choose the variable you think is most important and you optimize around that, you're creating a dangerous uniformity of behavior. You're not encouraging people to experiment necessarily. So you're also enforcing certain habits. Now, obviously, we shouldn't be too unfair. Very good sat navs actually do account for the volume of traffic at that time of day. Although how predictive they can be is always a tough question, because the weather will affect that, not just time of day, for example. But it is a problem in that the other thing that can be a problem is that when you present people arguably with choices that are just highly complex, and this is an issue that's raised around rail pricing, which is generally, both Pete and I think, will be fans of yield management pricing, of variable pricing, where you can travel on a train very cheaply at off-peak hours,
the Southwest model,
more expensively. Exactly. Southwest model. There is a downside to it. There's a big upside, undoubtedly, in terms of the efficient utilization of resources. There is a downside in that people get so confused by varying prices that they may actually just become blinded by the headlights and end up driving. I mean, there's a very big problem with it, by the way, which I ought to raise, which is that infrequent rail users tend to travel by train. Their rare rail journeys tend to be at Christmas, Easter, public holidays, where prices may be disproportionately high because there's excess demand, and also where the engineering work tends to be performed. So there's a fundamental problem with the rail network in Britain in that infrequent rail users, the kind of people who at Christmas go and see their mum in the country, have an expensive and a dismal experience.
Yeah.
So looking at it just from the view of, because ultimately people, there's a wonderful phrase someone used on Twitter the other day, which I think encapsulates a lot of behavioral science, which is, we don't actually understand what we see what we understand.
Yeah.
And we only really internalize those things we can make sense of. And so, yeah, there's undoubtedly the case that if Sullenberger had ended up with a worse cockpit design, it's also worth noting that he was a glider pilot in his spare time.
Oh, I see.
So he had quite a lot of instinctive experience of flying without engines, albeit for leisure purposes. And so his various instincts of the angle of gaze heuristic were also useful. Which may be something which someone who's flown with a highly automated cockpit wouldn't necessarily, a skill that they might not have necessarily developed.
Right.
But undoubtedly, it's true that actually the presentation of information in digestible and attractive forms, but also in forms that are comprehensible, but not necessarily what you might call monotonous. I think I think it's a nice thing to go, what are you prioritizing here? Is this actually a bit of a jolly trip where you wouldn't mind spending an extra 10 minutes to go past Stonehenge or to see the scenic route, or is this purely about speed optimization? I don't think that's I think there's an undoubted case where we've got to introduce messiness into the equation.
Yeah, the way people think.
Yeah, and actually encouraging to some extent a degree of experimentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some very interesting things, by the way, about how information changes behavior. One thing I will say about the sat nav is the sat nav made me a much more sensible driver, because one of the things you realize once you get a sat nav and it estimates your arrival time is there's a very, very big difference between traveling at 30 miles an hour and 50 in terms of your arrival time. Actually, the difference between going 68 and 82 miles an hour is more or less irrelevant. I mean, you barrel along the road at 84 miles an hour for about, 35 minutes, and you end up arriving 2 minutes earlier. Now, you were never aware of that before you had a sat nav.
Right.
I'll give you a very strange thing about how even when we think information is objective, it isn't. In the US and the UK, our measure of car economy, fuel economy, is miles per gallon. And therefore, we don't really differentiate intelligently between, to us, the difference between 35 and 50 miles to the gallon seems like a really big deal. Okay. Whereas the difference between 12 and 17 seems relatively trivial. Now, actually, in terms of cost saving and in terms of environmental benefit, the second is a much bigger deal proportionately than the first. Okay, we don't see it like that. Now, interestingly, in Europe, they tend to have liters per 100 kilometers is the measure. So their appreciation of fuel economy is subtly different, simply because the numerator and the denominator of the equation are the other way around. It's fuel per mile, not miles per fuel. Okay.
Right.
Now, I can add to that. I can add to that one to say you might conclude in Rory's description of the speedometer, sort of describing how our perception doesn't match reality, that's the nature of the story. But in fact, it's the metric we've chosen to represent reality, which is modifying our perception.
Modifying our reality.
That is to say, if you were a runner, or particularly a jogger, a runner, or an athlete, then you often measure speed not in 12 kilometers per hour, but you express it in 5 minutes per kilometer. You'll be doing 4-minute miles if you're very, very fast, 6-minute miles, 8-minute miles. And if our speedometers expressed speed in minutes per mile,
we drive completely differently.
That faculty would be totally changed. Anyway,
so how do you measure it as a triathlete, Pete?
So minutes per mile, because I think it's because your distance you need to travel. You might be running a marathon, let's say you're 26 miles, and if you're running in minutes per mile, then you can accurately see how a small change in your pace is what it's called rather than speed will affect the outcome or the target pace. So you want to do it in 4 hours, you divide that by 26, and you work out that you need to do. It's probably about 8-minute miles, and you structure it around that.
Lovely.
It's a very interesting thing, which is we assume that maths is objective, but even as trivial a distinction as whether you do it one way round or the other. So if we had car speedometers, which effectively said minutes for 10 miles as a speed measure, we would all drive in a completely different way, even though objectively, mathematically, the information is the same. This was the great lesson of my sat-nav, which is it made me a much less impatient driver in many respects. Because I realized that, it was very important not to get stuck in traffic in terms of arrival time, but actually the value of barreling down the road at 80 miles an hour, which was illegal and dangerous, and environmentally not altogether great shakes, in terms of time saving, was much, much less than it seemed.
Yeah, just to dovetail into that, I remember the first time I came into Heathrow some years back in the early 90s, and because we are European Union, so we have a different line at the passport control. And you have certain points which say that, okay, 25 minutes from here, 30 minutes from here to approach the immigration officer. Okay, it actually kind of calms your nerves. You're less irritated, you're less frustrated because you've done an 8-hour flight coming in from Bombay. And, so those are the small things that actually kind of probably you're able to create a far more objective realization of what to expect rather than just be suddenly bombarded with something which is very unpleasant. Nobody likes waiting in the line because it's very, very crowded at that place.
Oh yeah, the psychology of queuing is absolutely fascinating. Yeah, people, I mean, if you keep moving, you're much happier than if you grind to a halt. The worst thing you can have is a queue alongside your queue, which is moving faster than your queue. But the way we perceive
and it always
time,
seems that way.
It always, I know. Yeah, absolutely.
I do think queuing is a really nice petri dish or example of what you need to know about psychology, about fairness, about how much people disdain sort of uncertainty, how perception of time is malleable. Queuing's really got it all there.
I know, Pete, you have to move. Before you move out, on the personal front, what is a hobby or practice that brings you immense joy, apart from outside of work?
I think it is cycling, but not always cycling for transport, but cycling for leisure, for fitness, and for competition. And that competition, I like to feel, is always competing sort of against myself. And I get a great passion in trying to get a little bit better and work out those challenges that are mental as well as physical, and it really brings that sort of whole body experience that you can share with other people, and everyone at all their speeds has got their own challenges. It's very fulfilling.
There is an interesting finding that, Rory, Pete, you would be aware of, that Interbrand has put out. To move is to live.
I haven't seen that.
I'll send you the link after this. I'll send you an email. Take a look at it. It's very interesting. To live is to move is to live. Okay, and the expectations of the experiences, as you mentioned earlier, of the new me, what do I expect? Curbside pickup, instant delivery, driving a Ferrari on Fortnite. There are so many different levels of expectations that have come in, So brands, organizations, government entities, are we living up to the task? It's a very interesting take, actually, in terms of, especially what has transpired in the last couple of years and what has really, really moved the needle on the change of behaviors and expectations.
Well, I'll give you two big ones, which will be weird if you're in Dubai, but there are two things that I think are important, by the way. I always try, one of the things behavioral science does is I tend to also try the opposite take on things which are dangerous assumptions, because I think, so one of the things I query is the extent to which futurism assumes urban agglomeration is the only future for humanity. Okay. Now, my grandfather was a farmer. He went into market once a week to Abergavenny, but he spent 6 days in the countryside. Now, agglomeration does not necessarily require megacities. And I will raise this question. I think there's a difference between a city of 1 million people or 2 million and a city of 7 or 8. And when you start reaching certain sizes, you start getting problems emerging, actually. And we've probably fetishized the megacity dangerously. We've probably fetishized high-rise living too much. Okay, because and the other question I occasionally raise, just out of perversity, is we ought to do an honest cost-benefit analysis around the car, because we went from a period in the 1960s where the car was viewed to be the future of all transportation. We underinvested in rail. I think we're unfairly demonizing the car now, in that the way I would do congestion pricing for London is that I think that everybody in the UK is entitled to drive into London 5 days a year for free. One of the last times I drove into London was to pick someone up from a hospital. Okay, I think that's a reasonable use of my time driving into London. I don't think I should be penalised for doing that.
Right.
Okay, but it should become progressively more expensive the more often you drive it. Okay, I don't think it should be a flat rate charge. And it's worth noting that the car brings extraordinary benefits in that it's a different kind of network. One of the things that public transportation currently tends to do is it drives a hub and spoke model of transportation, which concentrates wealth in very specific nodes where the cost of property essentially starts to erode the value of the economic activity that's generated there. Because when you have a network where your location on the network is decisive to the value you derive from a network, it creates extraordinary concentration of property value where the landlord, rather than the worker, ends up as the main beneficiary. Now, one thing about cars, one thing about video conferencing, which I think is interesting, is they're less hub and spoke than that. Okay? They aren't as, the network of car driving is much, much more distributed and much less concentrated, which means that actually it tends to disperse wealth. I'd also argue, for example, okay, have you ever stayed in a great airport hotel? No. Airport hotels, railway station hotels, with a few notable exceptions, tend to be rubbish. Why? Because their existence depends on their location, not on their quality. If you drive into the English countryside, you can go to an English country house hotel, which is absolutely fabulous, because the only reason it can survive is because it's a brilliant hotel and people drive there. Okay.
Right.
So I occasionally will engage in very unfashionable things like a paean of praise to the American strip mall, which is a car park. You tend to have an anchor store, and then you have like Kinko's, nail bar, donut place, coffee place, weird Japanese restaurant. Now, actually, those places are rather wonderful because they create an ecosystem where if you get the mix of services right, someone can drive there, interact in one visit with a whole different mix of weird businesses from the big to the small, and then drive home again. They're kind of magical. I mean, okay, they're aesthetically, they're a bit of a nightmare, right? But actually, they're social spaces as well. You might meet your neighbors. Right. So one of the things I'm very conscious of is that futurism is unbelievably monolithic in its thinking. And actually, what's the population of Dubai?
Dubai is just under 3 million. UAE is about close to 9.3 million.
So here's an interesting theory, okay, purely a theory. Don't make Dubai any bigger. Make another city of 2 or 3 million about 20 miles away and connect them by train.
That's what they're doing, actually. Dubai South,
right.
They're going right into the hinterland. And where the expo is happening right now is it's good 65, 70 kilometers away. But the infrastructure is beautifully connected. So they expect that city to accommodate about 4 to 5 million people in the next 15 to 20 years.
Now, it's difficult because cities have a massive winner-takes-all effect. Oh, sorry, Pete, I understand this.
Thanks, Pete.
There tends to be absolute joy.
Excellent. Thank you.
But
thank you so much.
You have this winner-takes-all effect, which is highly problematic. And actually, when a city, okay, London undoubtedly, through this winner-takes-all effect, as a consequence of globalization, generates or at least extracts or generates, depending on your point of view, an enormous amount of wealth by dint of this dominance.
Right.
But the scale is problematic. So, for example, if you get a bunch of people who've got university friends, they're more or less forced to move to London if they don't want to lose touch with their friends. So they've gone to university in Newcastle or Bristol or a rather nice town of exactly a kind of same size.
Right.
But if they want to stay in touch with their friends and engage in a flat share, they basically end up moving to London, whether they like it or not. But they like it. But the extent to which this winner-takes-all effect. Now, one interesting thing is undoubtedly to invest in circular railways and roads and penetrating railways, not just hub and spoke terminus outward rail. Because one of the things is that the London Overground is an absolutely spectacular success because it's kind of it's a ring road for the rail network.
Right. In fact,
and that
one of
generates. Yeah,
Go ahead,
that
please.
spreads economic activity outwards. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, there is often an accusation of transit service that it is still too focused on connecting people to businesses and places where they can spend money, like sports
Yeah.
stadiums or whatever it is. So I think what you're saying, if people, when they're actually doing the blueprints and they're taking cognizance of something like this, it'll be far more consumed, so to speak.
So my interesting question is also, we have to factor in the fact that, when I was a kid, London was interesting in a lot of ways in which my Welsh market town where I grew up was a bit boring. Okay, in terms of retail, okay, you just as an absolutely thing. Okay, the retail scene in London was much more interesting than the retail scene in Monmouth. Now, the internet has kind of changed that. The entertainment scene, okay? Netflix is just the same if you live in a small town as if you live in. If I want to watch Korean films, okay, it used to be that, I'd have a 15-year wait in Monmouth before a Korean film ever came on. In London, I could probably go and see a Korean film once every few weeks, okay? A lot of that has actually, the internet is, has reduced the need for agglomeration.
Yeah,
okay. Social life arguably has. If you're young and you want to meet people and you want to partay, or if you're in the dating scene, the need for agglomeration is still fairly pronounced. Although you could even argue that Zoom dating wouldn't be impossible for a first date. Okay, but but actually, the need for agglomeration in terms of enjoyment and utility has to some extent diminished. Okay. The best bookshop used to be in London. Now it's, let's be honest, it's online, isn't it? Okay. If I want interesting food, there are Michelin-starred restaurants in London which will deliver to me. Okay. So this agglomeration thing does worry me because it's such an assumption of the futurist lobby and the environmental lobby, by the way, which is slightly dishonest because cities produce less carbon, but the things they consume, of course, are not produced in cities. They're produced in China, or they're produced. So cities end up with an artificially low carbon footprint by dint of effectively outsourcing manufacturing to.
Hello.
Hi. I mean, the car is, our assumption that the car is awful. Hold on a second. Let's be a bit careful there. If you have 3 young children, yes, you can use public transportation. Okay. But I don't envy you that. You've got 2 buggies, you've got a bag full of weird things. You need to carry, nappies. You need to carry. It's very easy for childless people who already live in central London to disparage the car. But actually, the car allows people to live in places they otherwise couldn't inhabit. The rail network outside London depends to a large extent on people driving to a station.
The book Tim Ferriss had written, The 4-Day Work Week, or the 4-Hour Work Week. Okay. And he had given a very fascinating example of, so you want to live in a penthouse with butler service overlooking the Central Park in New York. That's going to cost you $8,000 a day. Okay. And what if I give you the same thing in Sao Paulo at $800 a month? So if you're prepared to move out, and there is enough of the same kind of experiences that you can have, provided we are able to kind of migrate our thinking from the legacy.
The most interesting thing?
Yeah.
The most interesting thing is, by the way, the Burj Al Khalifa is not a bad idea because, the Eiffel Tower was a pretty good idea in terms of putting Paris on the map.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Absolutely.
Very interesting. China has banned skyscrapers. Do you notice this?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Nationally. So, depending on the size of the city, a skyscraper, I think technically is 250 meters. Is that right? I can never, maybe 150 meters. There are certain exceptional cases where you can build as higher than that. In smaller cities, they're actually banning even lower buildings than that. And they realize that the whole thing has turned into a massive runaway signaling problem, really, where cities are doing it for status reasons.
Yeah.
Or else or else there's a kind of fundamentally unwholesome drive. And actually, if you look at the Manhattan real estate market, they're now referred to as safety deposit boxes in the sky. The apartments in these buildings exist not really as a form of accommodation, but as a store of wealth. Now, in China, where it's harder and harder to invest in things other than property, the distortion of this effect is quite spectacular, because people who are working in Shenzhen can't afford to actually buy property where they work. So they buy property in some other city as an investment thing. And some of those people are going to end up badly disappointed. And so the extent to which the Chinese property market was overcooked, in the way that the Japanese property market became overcooked, seems to me a recurrent problem. Now, it's very, very interesting that receives so little news coverage, the fact that the Chinese had banned skyscrapers.
No, I was not aware of that, actually. It's not come in the news in any case, this part of town.
Yeah.
So I just want to kind of pick up on this quote of yours. To be brilliant, you have to be irrational. Okay. Do you get that kind of a leeway in your everyday practice when you're consulting with brands and companies?
Yeah, it's always worth looking at. I always look in any conversation with what are the things people don't say because it sounds stupid or childish.
Or
Quite
it's
often
never been said before.
Yeah, to arrive at an intelligent answer, sometimes you've got to ask some really stupid questions, or questions that make you sound stupid. And the one big advantage I will say of being 56 years old, okay, is that people generally, when you ask a very simple question, have you ever seen that scene in Margin Call when Jeremy Irons comes in and says to me, please explain to me the problem as you would to a small child or an intelligent Labrador? He says that of the financial crisis.
Right.
And one of the strange things is that you can, as an older person, ask for simplification without the same loss of status that happens when you're 26. Right. You can occasionally go, can we please go back to basics here? I'm going to ask some childish questions. And it doesn't come across in quite the same way.
So we don't have to actually spell it out as purposeful provocation.
Sometimes you've got to ask stupid questions.
Sorry.
And to go back to that original point, it's to some extent back to anthropology, that the tribe develops its own tribal metrics and its own tribal, I think it's called a habitus in anthropology. Now, the gain to this focus is specialization, and specialization of knowledge, and the development of an arcane vocabulary and an argot. The price you pay for this is an extraordinary creation of blind spots, of unknown unknowns or unnoticed unknowns.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have unknown knowns, which are things that everybody assumes, but which aren't true. And so I think, one of the things I think is vital is that I'm not only, at the small scale, I'm an evangelist for behavioral science. At the larger scale, I'm an evangelist for cognitive diversity, for having a mixture of different. By the way, one of the things I think is significant is that I think that I have two Indian friends who argue that Indians are particularly good at this because you're polytheistic. Okay. And that you don't necessarily have to have one theory to explain everything. You're perfectly content with multiple explanations. Okay. And both my Indian friends always say, yeah, the problem you guys have is you're monotheists deep down, or you're monotheorists.
Right.
And by the way, I see India as an extraordinary powerhouse. I'm much more interested in India than China, precisely because India's economic growth has been messy, whereas China's has been neat. And I tend to see India's growth as organic and China's as being, to some extent, the product of artificial fertilizers.
Absolutely.
It's a faster rate of growth, but it's a less stable ecosystem. And I find, and I think, by the way, I think everybody has made a mistake by focusing on the one rather than the other.
Right.
Because I think, so. But I think ultimately what I would argue is that it's extremely dangerous getting a group of like-minded specialists in a room who are all seeing the problem entirely through the same lens. And so, if banks had employed the one thing I would have done right if you put me in charge of a bank, I wouldn't have been very good at the job. But the one thing I would have done right if you put me in charge of Lehman Brothers in, 1998, okay, is I would have employed a couple of bearded Marxists. Okay, literally, I would have said, okay, you know, all of us are in love with this system. We believe it. We inherently, I'm going to employ a couple of, bearded, Italian Marxists or something, right? Okay. And your job is to come to me once a week and explain what's wrong.
Right.
Okay. And one of the things, one of the reasons I'm politically a conservative with a small c is that conservatism tends to be a little less dogmatic. At its best. At its worst, it's terrible, by the way. It's every bit as dogmatic as everything. The American political right has become hopelessly dogmatic, I think. But what you might call fuzzy conservatism does have the virtue, which is that, to be honest, you can reinvent your frame of reference occasionally. And I think one of the things that's most dangerous is, when you get transport engineers solving a transport problem, it goes back to the point Pete made right at the beginning. To a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right. Absolutely.
And that, one thing would be lovely with Dubai would be, let's go in and say, okay, how do you create, one thing about America, actually, they do pretty good suburbia, don't they?
Right, absolutely.
We have to say that actually, now, so I'm conscious of the fact that for me to go and praise suburbia, okay, would be the kiss of death. Okay, I'm supposed to be there as a futurist, basically, bigging up and boostering the urban, high density, high altitude living future. Now, here's an interesting fact. Okay. People who live high up in a building, I think, and in very large cities with tall buildings, the rate of depression rises by 40% and the rate of schizophrenia rises by 100%. Now, I'm not sure that's a product of the built environment exclusively. Okay?
Yeah.
Nonetheless, cities manifest those figures, whether you like it or not. What the causation is, we can debate.
Right.
Now, that would be enough to get a drug ban. Right, those figures. And yet, because it's a city, not a drug, and we look at it through these economic lenses of, huge gains to agglomeration, and what are their gains to specialization, economies of scale, division of labor, blah, 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 blah. We have these economic tools, and they become completely all-encompassing. Now, actually, okay, let's look at the theory of comparative advantage. We use those tools to a point where all PPE was produced in China, which meant that when there was a bloody pandemic in China, which is the place where pandemics tend to start, where they tend to originate, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, it might have been a lab leak. Let's be honest here. Okay?
Right.
It was completely wrong to dismiss that as a conspiracy theory. I thought that was extraordinary that people did that.
Right.
But when the pandemic originated in China, suddenly you couldn't get any PPE. Okay, so you've done this thing now. To do that at a local scale, where Sheffield specializes in steel, and Northampton specializes in shoes, is one thing. When you do that at a global scale, the risk to fragility in supply chains that results. There's a huge value to having diversity of supply. And one of the strangest things, if you think about it, okay, in the pandemic, is that we ran out of PPE. There were staff in the NHS wearing bin bags as protective material for a short time.
Right.
We ran out of PPE. Okay, we never ran out of food. And it occurred to me that one of the unseen benefits of diversity of consumer taste, okay, is it actually creates resilience unintentionally in the system. Because people have lots of different tastes in food. The market supplies them. You have Waitrose in the UK, you have Waitrose, Tesco, Lidl, Aldi, Sainsbury's, okay? That's inefficient from the point of view of a top-down planner. But it does create resilience. Now, interestingly, if you had a world, purely as a thought experiment, where doctors bought their own PPE, Okay, and some people would choose one kind and some people would choose another kind, and Arsenal fans would want PPE with a big Arsenal logo on it. Okay, and some people would choose floral PPE. Okay, we probably wouldn't have had the same problem.
Yeah.
And it was a problem, of course, which happened in the Soviet Union, which is the system was so optimized that if one thing broke, okay, if one thing broke, everything else downstream became totally dysfunctional.
Yeah.
What tended to happen in the Soviet Union, which was very interesting, the interesting thing is what happened in the Soviet Union is the consumer interest, because it was at the bottom of the chain, tended to get deprioritized against the B2B interest. So if you ran out of steel, or you had a steel shortage, you'd continue to supply tractors, but you wouldn't supply domestic cars, for instance.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I think is interesting is that commoditization looks rational to people of a narrow economic mindset, but it's extraordinarily dangerous.
I can get that, actually. Absolutely.
That actually commoditization tends to create a kind of create extraordinary points of vulnerability in the overall system.
Strange you mentioned that, because what I was coming to next was we've all been brought up on the doors of USP, unique selling proposition. And in an increasingly commoditized world, I think we need to seriously
Sorry, just play again.
I said we've all been brought up on this.
You're breaking up a bit. Sorry.
Is it better now? Is it better?
It's better now. Perfect now. Yeah.
Okay. So we've all been brought up on this huge dose of USP, unique selling proposition. Isn't it? I mean, USP, products, services, etc., etc. But in an increasingly commoditized world, don't you think we need to move to something else, probably with a different, similar? Sorry, it was a problem at my end. Yeah.
No problem. I'm back again.
Yeah. I was talking about, this huge preference and huge baggage that we carry about USP, unique selling proposition in products, goods, and services, wherein now we're in an increasingly commoditized world. Don't you think we need to move on to something? Maybe it sounds very similar to that phonetically, but UFP, which is unique feelings proposition, your affinity towards a product or a brand or a service is more towards how you're made to feel about it, about consuming it.
Yes, I mean, there is this assumption in economics that more consumption is the only route towards greater well-being. Now, the argument I've occasionally made, which sounds a bit self-serving and probably is that brand value, if you want to call it brand value, that's to use marketing terminology, but what do you call the value through meaning? And that would include, design. It would include the emotional. There's a wonderful phrase from Harley Earl, who was a great Cadillac designer, who said that the appearance of the car is a visible receipt for the money the customer has spent. Okay.
Beautiful.
So the fins and the chrome and everything else, okay, is a visual receipt.
Absolutely.
For the payment. Now, I think looking at things and saying, how do we maximize not this notion of utility, but how do we maximize the emotional value of what we create is actually to the benefit of the environment. Yeah, because emotional value requires less carbon to manufacture than use value, because we can manufacture meaning on. Don't worry, I'll just reiterate what I just said, which is you can create meaning value on a screen, whereas to create use value, you need a factory. And therefore, value and appreciation and enjoyment delivered psychologically can be produced at a lower cost to the environment and a lower cost to the earth and to raw materials than value created through making. And I would argue, by the way, that a large part of the environmental solution is to get people to buy less of better. It doesn't necessarily require sacrifice. I think we have to ask tough questions about fast fashion, really.
Yeah.
And we have to ask tough questions about certain behaviors like that. But I think that meaning value, that significance, that something that develops emotional appreciation can be produced at relatively high levels of, low levels of carbon footprint compared
and still
to
make
actually
profitability,
manufacturing more things, and still be profitable. Yeah.
As it is said, doing good is doing great for brands.
I mean, a really interesting question is, should we encourage people? This will go down very well in Dubai. In some sense, okay, if you buy a Fendi bag, that will continue to be traded on eBay, or I think there's a Vestaire Collective, okay. You probably won't throw that away. You'll sell it or you'll keep it. Okay.
Yeah.
If you buy now, there's some question which is, at some part of this, luxury goods actually have a role to play.
Yeah.
I was, just before I came on board, I was looking at an extraordinary British car called the Gordon Keeble.
Mm-hmm.
And I think only about 80 of them were made. I saw one once. The interesting thing about the Gordon Keeble, it was designed by Julio Giugiaro, who was, I think, the greatest car designer of the last century. He's still alive. The interesting thing is, of all 60 that were ever built, all of them are still on the road.
Wow.
Okay. And it was built I think before I was born. It was built about 55 years ago. But every single one of them is still actually taxed and in operation, which
so
is
obviously
pretty
you didn't
extraordinary.
hear of the term that Apple and Samsung and all those people use, planned obsolescence.
No, so it's so absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things is that built-in obsolescence, the light bulb, of course, being the famous example of that, is an interesting question. Do we actually just get people to, and also you can argue that experiences can be more or less environmentally damaging than goods.
Yeah. So
it's very, very complicated, undoubtedly. I just wondered whether I said to Ogilvy, my future plan should be I only fly once a year, but I do so in extreme luxury, and I go and stay in the place for 2 weeks. Very interesting fact. EY, at least in the UK, possibly worldwide, has banned all business flying for a stay of 1 night or less.
Okay.
So if you're not staying for 2 nights, you can't get on the plane. Now, okay, people might game the system by gratuitously staying for 2 nights. It's not a perfect rule, but it's very interesting. Google has instigated 2 weeks of work from anywhere, where you can actually. Now, in the United States, if you think about it, if you live 1,000 miles from your parents, which is perfectly possible in the United States, and you have 2 weeks vacation, that probably means you only get 1 week of the year to actually go and visit your parents. Now, you can actually go and visit your parents in one of those 2 work from anywhere weeks, and assuming your parents have a reasonable broadband connection, then, that seems to me a fairly major gain in quality of life at a fairly trivial cost.
Right. So true. Fascinating, Rory. I think it is a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I will pick up the pieces maybe in a separate conversation as well. Thank you so much for your time, insights, articulation, wisdom. Pleasure to have interacted with you. Thank you so much.
It's a joy anytime. Absolutely fantastic.
And